2011. My name is Joseph Padilla and we're in Denver, Colorado. I'm going to be interviewing Lou Lopez about his Korean War and his police department experiences. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, I'm Lou Lopez.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Lopez. First of all, we're going to kind of start out with who you are. Tell me about, where were you born?
I was born right here in Denver.
And where was that?
I was born actually in the east side, in a little terrace, the 3700 block of High Street. And my dad at the time was a machinist and was working in a machine shop, I guess is what best way of describing it. And my mother, of course, was ready to have me, and he rushed off trying to find some assistance. Now, we go back to March of 1932. It's cold. This poor guy is running down the street trying to find some phone to get an ambulance out or whatever to give Mom a helping hand, and I couldn't wait. She delivered me right in the kitchen of this little terrace on a cold March day, just she and I, all alone, and there I was. I was brought into this world. Nobody else except Mom and me.
Is that terrace still there? The house still there?
You know, Joe, I don't know whether it's still there. I don't think so. I think it's probably been demolished by now.
And what was that address again?
That address would be in the 3700 block of High Street. I don't exactly know where the address exactly.
Okay, so we're going to talk about your family life. Tell me about your childhood. What was your daily life like as a child?
Well, I'll tell you something. I think we had a pretty tight-knit family in terms of togetherness and responsibility that was thrust on our shoulders. My dad was a fellow that always worked, and he expected us to work. Now, I had an older brother, 2 years older, and I had a younger brother, 2 years younger. But I can remember my dad getting us up at 6 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, having breakfast, and hustling us off to a golf course so we could go and caddy all day. But that was my dad. He just insisted that we do something in terms of working. It was never necessary to turn in our money or anything else. We were able to do with our money that we earned whatever we wanted. But that was one of the insistence that my dad had on my life and my brother's life. And I think that that ethic has given me the drive that I have today in terms of accomplishment and achievement.
So you have two brothers. Those are the only siblings you have?
Yeah, correct.
And what about them? Where are...
My oldest brother is 80 years old now, and he's retired from Gates Rubber Company here in the city of Denver. My youngest brother, who is 2 years younger than I was on the Denver Fire Department and retired after 25 years on the fire department, and he's deceased.
Do either of them have any military experience?
My oldest brother was in the Colorado National Guard, but he never saw any active duty.
Okay, and so did you, when you were younger, did you have to help take care of your younger brother? Did you have to provide any assistance to your mother?
No, well, yeah, we always had chores. We always had responsibilities, chopping wood and bringing in the coal. Back in those days, you didn't have electric ovens and microwaves, and everything was done in the stove. Middle of the summer, Mom would be out there stoking up the stove, cooking breakfast, that type of thing. So, we had responsibilities when I was a young guy.
And what types of things would you do together with your brothers when you were little?
Well, we were very tight and close, more so with my older brother than my kid brother. Basketball. We had basketball backboards on our side of our old house, and we had neighborhood kids coming in and playing basketball. So we always were involved in something in terms of sporting type of stuff. I recall getting involved in the boxing game at an early age. I guess I was about, I couldn't have been more than 13 or 14. when I started in amateur boxing and training, traveling all the way into downtown Denver on an old tramway streetcar and going to this gym, and we'd do that maybe 2 or 3 nights a week and work out. And then we always participated in the annual Golden Gloves boxing tournament that was held here in the city of Denver at the old, they used to call it the old Elks Punch Bowl at 15th in California. And we participated on that. I participated in that probably 3 or 4 years.
Was that as a boxer or as a coach?
No. As a young little boxer. And many of those young people that I was training with and participating in the boxing end of it are still friends of mine today. Many of them are still alive.
So what ended up your boxing career? You stayed within the boxing profession for quite a few years, and how did you...
Well, Joe, that I continued participating in sports, never actively involved in any high school type sport, but I did participate in softball, a lot of fast pitch softball. I was on probably the first all Hispanic softball team here in the city of Denver, and it was in the southwest quadrant of the city. I went to South High School and graduated from South High School. I was probably one of maybe 8 or 9 Hispanic students at South High School at the time. But there was an enclave of Hispanics in southwest Denver, and we all of our parents were working at the time in a foundry, and they hired mostly Hispanic men to work in this foundry, and it was called Griffin Wheel Works.
Where was it located?
It was on West Evans, and it would be west of the Platte River. And they had company housing. And I remember there was a 2-story building that I lived in when we were just tiny. I don't think I was more than 4 or 5 years old when we were living in this thing. And it was a company apartment place. It was a 2-story thing. And of course we were walking. We didn't have any other means of transportation. And we had to probably walk a total of maybe a mile to get to the streetcar. Back in those days, they had these streetcars that ran back and forth, and we'd catch the streetcar on Evans and Broadway, the old number 3. And these were old yellow, electric run type streetcars. Just a thing of the past. But I always remember those days very fondly.
And back when you were a child, what were your favorite memories of when you were a child, things that you might have done?
My memories? Gosh, I guess, I don't know. Joe, I guess I always go back to my days in my religious training, going to catechism, going to Mass with my mother and father every Sunday. And we would go to San Cayetano, St. Cajetan's. Back in those days, this was on about... over on the west side, it would be 7th and, oh gosh, I couldn't even give you the exact location. But Metro State has now turned the church into a community type of facility. Maybe you're acquainted with it.
I am, yes. Yeah. There's a lot of historic history, Hispanic history tied to that church.
Well, I went to my catechism training there. It was all done in Spanish. All of my prayers were learned in Spanish. Go to Mass every Sunday, and we'd sit there, and and the old priest would get up there, and a Theatin's priest from Spain would get up there, and he would be up on the pulpit for a good hour, and I'd be squirming all over the place, wanting to get out of there. But that was my early remembrance, and another great memory that I would have of my childhood is going through catechism and getting those little religious pictures for having recited my prayers properly or whatever. We were taught by an old Mexican lady, little Mexican lady. Um, God, she was probably in her 70s at the time, and she took on the role of teaching us catechisms. So those were always great, fond memories of mine.
When you weren't there, what were your favorite places to hang out as a kid?
Well, you know, I remember playing a lot of golf. As a young kid, I caddied at golf courses, different golf courses here in the city of Denver. But I don't know, it seemed like we'd caddy every day except Mondays. And Mondays was always caddy's day, and we were always free to go out and play the golf course. We would borrow a set of golf clubs from maybe one of the members, and we'd go out and play golf and play 17 holes at, for instance, Cherry Hills here in the city of Denver. There's a huge lake there. We'd play 17 holes, and then we'd quit playing golf. We'd go in the water and hustle golf balls for probably a couple hours, and that was how we would spend a Monday. But Sundays, I didn't know what a Sunday was off to have off. You know, of course we'd be going to church, but Sundays I would be caddying. Saturdays I'd be caddying. Those were big days. So I had various jobs when I was a young kid. Worked in a bowling alley for a while. Did a whole lot of things. Worked in the grocery store, stocking shelves. So there was a lot of things that I was involved in. But one of the things, and you know, when I spoke of work ethics that my dad instilled in us, this came into being as a result of his, not insistence, but his push towards us doing that type of thing. And you know, I look back on those as fond days also. You know.
Where were your parents born? Where were they from?
My dad was born in Pueblo, my grandmother in Walsenburg. My mother's parents were, my grandfather was born also in southern Colorado, as was my grandmother. Both of them, of course, American citizens, but never spoke any English. My grandfather's English was very broken. My grandmother never did speak English. My parents, of course, were bilingual. And I guess that I was speaking Spanish before I spoke English. And when I started school, I guess I was bilingual because I got along fine in elementary school, and yet I spoke Spanish. When I went on to school, University of Colorado, I used to walk into the classroom. There was a professor from Mexico City that was the professor, and whenever I'd walk into his classroom, he'd start pulling his hair because my Spanish was local colloquialism, and I mean it was the type of Spanish that you speak in the rural villages of northern New Mexico, which brings me up to we used to spend summers in some of our summers in New Mexico when I was a young kid, in a place called Cebolla, New Mexico, in Rio Arriba County, and we'd go down there, and my aunt and uncle had this little ranchito. It wasn't a very big place, but I mean he had horses, and we'd spend them with our cousins riding horses and running around barefooted and just having a great time. But once again, you know, none of those young people down there spoke English. It was all Spanish, and that's the way we conversed. So, you know, that influence of the Spanish language came into being a lot when I was a young kid.
And your parents, did they speak English very well?
Oh yeah, very, very well, yeah.
And what did your parents? You said your father was a machinist.
Yeah, he was a machinist. He retired from Gates Rubber Company here in the city of Denver as a machinist. My mother, my gosh, you know, three kids, and she was always working. She worked in a bakery for a long while. She went to work at Samsonite luggage manufacturing company here in the city of Denver, and spent possibly Probably around 23, 24 years working for them, and she retired from there. So that was pretty much what my mother did, and my dad was always involved in working as a machinist. During World War II, my dad left the city of Denver along with 3 or 4 other neighbors and traveled to San Francisco and settled there in San Francisco and sent for us 6 months later. I guess we landed in San Francisco possibly in 1942 or thereabouts. He was working for Matson Navigation as a machinist. They were making Liberty ships at the time. So, but the gentleman that he went to California with lived in the neighborhood, and they prior to that time, as I recall, as you remember, I talked about Griffin Wheel Works. They all worked at Griffin Wheel Works, and there was an enclave of Hispanic people in Southwest Denver, possibly some of the very first of Hispanic people in that part of the city. Subsequently, most of us went through South High School, went through the elementary, middle, and senior high school in South Denver.
And what were your parents' names?
My dad's name, believe it or not, Joseph O'Neill Lopez, and my mother's name was Elvira Lopez. Her middle name was, or her maiden name was Archuleta.
Excellent. And did any members of your family participate in World War II?
No, other than my dad's participation as a shipyard worker in San Francisco.
What traditions did your mother and father maintain from their upbringing?
They what?
What traditions did your mother and father maintain from their upbringing that you recall?
Traditions, you're talking about...
certain foods or...
No, you know, back in those days, Joe, it was during the Depression years that I remember. My dad always had a garden, and Mom and Dad bought a little house. God, it was possibly towards the 39, maybe about 37. They bought this little house. And I remember when they bought the house, there were some neighbors that circulated a petition to keep us from moving in.
Because of your race?
Yeah, oh yeah. But we moved in, and you know, Dad had such a personality, as did my mother, that it wasn't long before, you know, we won over all of those people that had signed that petition. But you know, I look back on those years, and I never held anything against anyone as a result of their discriminations, and there were times where, you know, it was, of course, at that age, you don't really pay too much attention to it. You just go on about your business. And I think that one of the things that I can always stand up and be counted on is that, you know, I would take a position, and if I didn't like something, I'd let somebody know and I'd go on about my business. But I think that this, you know, we talked briefly about this boxing thing, you know, that boxing is like, you know, the karate or anything else. You know, you develop the ability within yourself to deal with any situation that should come up. You know, that self-confidence comes out. And it's not necessary to go around pushing people, because you know what you're capable of. And I think that you carry yourself in a manner that brings about respect from others when they see how you carry yourself. And that's always been my case. I've never had any problems with anything, even when I was on the police department. I never had any problems.
When you were young, did your family have to struggle financially?
Absolutely.
What was that like? How did it affect your family?
Well, you know, during the Depression years, and I told you about this garden that Dad always had. You know, there was always corn, there was always chili, there was always, you know, the type of thing. And then we always had chickens. But there was a period there where my dad wasn't working, nor my mother. And subsequently, we were receiving some handout food. You know, it would be brought. I remember trucks would come by, and Mom and Dad go out and bring back food into the house. But Dad worked. He would find jobs. I remember my dad going to Kimball, Nebraska, and working thinning beets in Kimball, Nebraska. But that type of stuff, he didn't do that very often. But we always had food on the table. We were always clothed not nicely, but I mean, adequately. But we had a good childhood.
What about toys? Did your parents make toys for you, or what type
Joe,
of toys?
once again, I started out at such a young age caddying that about the only toys I had were golf balls and golf clubs. So subsequently, that was pretty much the thing that we would do when we were small. Yeah.
How old were you when your parents died?
Well, let's see. My dad died in 1981, so I was born in 32. So he died in 81. My mother passed away in about 1995.
Okay. Do you think your attitudes about the country were different than your parents?
You know something, Joe. My parents were very patriotic. They believed in this country, even though there were times where even my parents were discriminated against. I told you about the time that they moved into this house and they had a petition
Right.
circulated. There was another time that not too far away from where we lived in West Denver on South Broadway, they denied them service in a bar. And Mom and Dad, along with another Hispanic couple, went in there to have a beer or something, and they refused them. And Mom and Dad and the other couple filed a lawsuit against those people and won.
Excellent.
Yeah. So they stood up, but they were patriotic.
Do you think the opportunities are different for you than, say, for your parents?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. My dad came from a meager starting in life, and he worked hard to become a machinist. There was the situation, as I recall, discrimination was rampant. As far as they were, when they were existing back in those days. Back in those days, Mom and Dad would shop on Larmer Street, for instance, and there was a Mexican area along Larmer Street, a Mexican theater called the Mexico. And I can remember as a kid going to that Mexican theater, going down and watching Cantinflas and some of these other people, as I could recall, sitting in that movie house. But we didn't have any, there wasn't any doctors. There was one doctor down on Larmer Street by the name of Dr. Alanis, and he serviced almost every Mexican family that existed in the metropolitan area. So and his office was right down there on Larmer Street. They had a tough time. They didn't. But I never heard my mom and dad either gripe about things. They just went about their business and took care of business.
Did you eat traditional Mexican food when you were a kid at home?
I have to laugh when I walk into a restaurant and they talk about what's these, oh God, the tortillas that are fried. You know, I got a mental block.
Sopapillas?
Sopapillas. Back in my days, those were munuelos. Ever hear the term munuelos?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so munuelos were nothing more than what you find a fancy word of sopapillas. I just, but my mother would make stacks of sopapillas and tortillas. I mean, I would watch my mother rolling the masa and with her little stick, broom handle, rolling out and flipping them back and forth, and on that wooden stove, and then picking up the tortilla and turning them over and putting the stack. by the end of 20 minutes or 30 minutes, she'd have a stack of tortillas like that. We always ate chili. We always had green chili going and in a pot, and frijoles and fried potatoes. That was a staple back in those days. Yeah. Along with the fried chicken that calabacitas that we would come out of the garden. We always had a great time. Yeah. I got a little tired of chicken because we had fried chicken, we had chicken dumplings, but I still like chicken today.
Excellent. So how many years total did you go to school?
I never did get a degree, Joe. I went through. I was going to the University of Colorado, but I went to the Extension Center, and I got in about. I almost finished. I had about 3 years in.
And then, why don't you tell me what the name of the different schools you went to were? Where you started elementary school?
All right, I went to elementary school here in the city of Denver, and there was an old brick store or elementary school called Milton, and it was on Evans about Bannock. And I remember the custodian lived in the basement, and he would stoke the furnace all night. They had coal delivered. That was the way they heated up the building. They had old wooden floors, and I remember he would have sawdust soaked in, I don't know, something. It was soaked in. But he'd have a big bucket. He'd be throwing this stuff out, and then he'd be sweeping it up. So that's the way he swept and kept those floors going in this old building. From there, I went to Rosedale, and got into Rosedale, which was here in the city of Denver, and then we went to San Francisco, and I spent most of my elementary school years in San Francisco, up into middle school in San Francisco, and then we came back from San Francisco. Ended up at South High School and graduating from there.
What year did you graduate?
1950.
And what types of activities or clubs did you participate in when you were in school?
Clubs?
Yeah.
I'll tell you, Joe, like I told you, there was about 8 or 9 total Hispanics in South High School. We weren't really invited to do a whole lot of, to become, choir members or any of that type speech. But, it was just one of those things. Back in those days, it was that way.
What did you think about your teachers? Do you feel you're treated differently or just like everyone else?
Obviously, Joe, there was a difference. First of all, I wasn't, and this is one of the things that I always felt bad about. I didn't get involved in, say, math courses and that type of stuff. I was more or less going after those easy courses just to get out of school. As far as the teachers are concerned, I don't remember being harshly treated or anything else by teachers. I was a good student in terms of I minded my business and I never created problems for them. And I got through school, but not with not with the type of credentials that would have gotten me at University of Denver or University. It was just to get through school.
Mm-hmm. What do you remember most about your high school days?
Actually, Joe, I participated. I did play golf. And I did quite well in that area when I was in high school. And city champion for about 3 years in a row. That type of stuff. But other than that, I didn't participate in basketball or wrestling or anything else. I was still involved in boxing at that point in my young life. So I spent a lot of time going back and forth to gyms, boxing gyms.
Did you work while you were in school?
Yeah. Once again, caddying, winter months, bowling alleys, working in bowling alleys. There was an old roller skating rink here in the city of Denver that was in South Denver, and I worked there for a while. But I always worked. I also worked in a foundry, but that was in my senior year in high school, and I was getting out of school about noon, and I was going to work at this foundry, and I'd work from maybe noon until about 5 o'clock in the afternoon or something, and that was 5 days a week. So I did that in my senior year.
When you were busy working, what types of things did you do with your friends after school?
A lot of movies. I ran around with. I didn't have any Anglo buddies. They were all Hispanic buddies. Two in particular that I spent a long time with. I grew up, of course, in a Hispanic environment. The kids that I grew up with were all Hispanic, even though we lived within an Anglo neighborhood. Whether or not, I don't even remember, but we hung around together, the Hispanic kids.
Do you think the education received is about the same that your brothers received?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. What do you remember was going on in the country and your community when you're growing up in the 40s?
Doing what?
What do you remember was going on in the country and your community as you're growing up in the 40s?
Well, I guess, Joe, the only thing that I can recall is the World War II, of course, and going into San Francisco. Mm-hmm. At the time, San Francisco had blackouts. The entire city would be blacked out when it got dark. And I can recall these great big searchlights going back and forth across the sky. I can remember caddying in a golf course, which is right next to the ocean. And they had a whole lot of military type stuff there, and I would imagine artillery there on the coast, and a lot of, you couldn't get into that particular area, but the golf course ran right alongside of it. I remember Victory Gardens back in those days. Kids going and growing their own vegetables. Mom and Dad's were always working. I know that Mom worked and Dad worked, so we didn't have much parental supervision during those years, during the war years. I remember collecting bottles, collecting aluminum, collecting rubber. They always had these drives for that type of stuff. I remember the food stamps that they had in the wartime. Restriction on butter and bread, and not butter, butter and meat, for instance. Shoes. Gasoline was practically unavailable at the time. Not many people operated automobiles. So those are the years that I remember in World War II. I had an uncle killed in France, and that would have been 1944, I guess. He was killed. He had two small children when he went over. He was shot and killed in. It was in France.
What was his name?
His name was Pete Gomez. Yeah.
How did that affect your family?
Well, it affected my aunt very much so. She never remarried. The two children went on, and the son went on into the Marine Corps and became quite a success with IBM, I think it was. And the daughter ended up getting married, both of them getting married, and she was a homestayer with their family.
What do you recall about the time the Korean conflict started? How old were you?
I was just graduated from high school, Joe, when that took place, June of 1950. And I graduated from school in June of 1950.
And what are your memories about that, when it started and what it was like?
I remember the invasion. The North Koreans come in, pushing the Americans all the way back. and the fact that the American forces were about to be pushed off of the Korean Peninsula, and the fact that they at the time they I guess they were starting with the drafting thing, and that came about. But yeah, I remember the Korean War when it started.
We'll kind of get into now some of the war experiences. Were you part of any organizations before Korea, LULAC, or anything like that?
No.
Okay. Did you support the war effort when you first heard about it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
How would you consider yourself? Back then, Democrat, Republican, Independent?
Well, we were always Democrats. My dad, my mother, the Roosevelt was our hero. My grandparents' hero, my mother's and dad's hero, and that's the way I grew up, a Democrat.
Excellent. And did you discuss the war with your friends or your family?
I must have, Joe. I can't recall.
Do you remember thinking that you wanted to go to Korea or no?
Well, you know what, Joe, I went in the Naval Reserve shortly after high school, and I stayed in the reserve up until I asked for active duty. And when I asked for active duty, I went through. Well, I had some training, like I had boot training during my reserve period, and then when I asked for active duty, of course, I went through boot camp again, and I went through Great Lakes Naval Training Center in the winter months.
What year would that have been?
That would have been 1951, 52, 51-2. Yeah.
And then, so what happened to you then?
Pardon me?
And then where did you go after you went through Great Lakes?
Well, Joe, the war was growing pretty good during that period of time, and they flew me from Chicago to San Francisco, and I went through. I stayed in Treasure Island there for about a week or 2 weeks, and then I caught a troop transport going over the USS Breckenridge, and my God, Joe, they must have had 3,000, 4,000 troops aboard that ship when we went over, and it took us I think about 12 days from San Francisco, Fort Mason in San Francisco to Yokohama, and we got into Yokohama and they unloaded us. There was a lot of Army people aboard that ship and a lot of Navy people, and we went into a tent city in outside of Yokohama, and there a short period of time, and then they loaded us on a real narrow gauge type train that went all the way across the northern, from Yokohama to the northern tip of Japan, and it took us, I don't know, maybe a couple of days to get there on this train, and I ended up in a port city called Sasebo, Japan, and they took me off this train, and I went aboard a ship, receiving ship there in the harbor. And I stayed there for possibly 3 or 4 days until my ship, I was already assigned to a ship, came into port. It had been over in Korean waters and had come back. So I boarded my ship, I guess in the spring of about 1952, and I went aboard this ship. And I stayed aboard that ship the entire time I was in the military.
What was your job?
You know what? I ended up, this was a huge repair ship, Joe. It had about 800 people aboard, all types of people. I mean, from precision people to people like myself working in a foundry, making castings. We repaired a hell of a lot of ships aboard that ship of mine. It was called the Hector, USS Hector AR-7, and I did that, and the only reason I did that was because of my previous experiences working in a foundry when I was in high school.
Do you think the assignments are distributed equally between Anglos, Latinos, African American troops?
In the military?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think so, Joe. I don't think that there's a whole lot of, at least now, even in my day, I didn't see a whole lot of difference. I was never discriminated against in the military. The only time I can ever recall being discriminated against was when I first went aboard that ship. You had to go in through to the mess hall, and you'd line up, and there would be a guy there clicking the numbers of people coming through. And I remember this guy would always stop me, and he did that for about 3 or 4 days, stopping me. And finally I says, "What's your problem?" And we got into a verbal discussion, at which time I told him, I says, "What time do you get off work?" At which time he told me, and I says, "I want to see you here," and I says, "I want to talk to you." At which time I met him there, and I settled it with this guy. But you know, he later became a very good friend of mine.
And was he just throwing you out because you're...
Well, this fellow was from Brooklyn, and he must have thought he was some kind of a tough guy or something. I don't know, because he didn't impress me. Because he didn't last long, I guarantee you that. But he developed a lot of respect for me, and it didn't take very long to let him know exactly where I stood, you know. And he never bothered me there after I'd gone. But we used to laugh about it later on. Yeah.
What about your friends on ship? Did you...
Oh, I had a lot of friends.
Did you associate with other Latinos?
Oh, no. Well, there weren't too many. There wasn't another Latino in the foundry where I was working. And I developed some real shipmate buddies there in that foundry. 3 or 4 of them that I always pulled liberty with.
Okay. And did you have the opportunity to speak Spanish when you were in the war or anything? Or in the service?
Well, with others aboard the ship, yeah, you know. My mom would send me. As I recall, she could somewhere or another. I remember her getting salsa to me somewhere. But I had that. But the other thing that I had going for me was that one of the cooks was a Greek fella from right here from Denver. Was a cook, and I continued this boxing thing when I was aboard that ship. So I would participate in bouts, maybe once, twice a month. And we would go ashore to the Fleet Landing where they would have these shows. And I mean, this was a huge harbor. They'd probably have, maybe 50 ships in that harbor. So there was a great pool of young people participating in this boxing thing. So I was able to participate in a lot of bouts, and I had an opportunity to. I used to enjoy getting in the ring with English sailors. And, you know, I just used to feast on them. Mm-hmm. But I had a good time. I worked out all the time. I was able to get off the ship and go to the Fleet Landing and work out quite often. So I had a lot of liberties, and subsequently I developed a following of good friends, you know, as a result of participating in that sport.
Other than boxing, what else do you do for fun while you're in the service?
Well, I played baseball for the ship's team also. Yeah, I told you that we had the first all Hispanic softball team in the city of Denver. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I continued that, and I played baseball in the military. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I was active.
So, what are some of your fondest memories from being in the military?
I guess it was participation in that boxing thing. I served with some good people. I had good relationships with all of my bosses and the chiefs that were working with me. I pulled mess duty one time. That went on for 3 months. Horrible period of my time. You know, you get up at you were up at 4:30 in the morning, so you could get set up for breakfast, because breakfast would be starting about 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, and you'd have to feed the whole ship. And these people coming in, And they, back in those days, you had the mess line, and you ate off of trays, aluminum trays. So they'd stack up those dirty trays, and you'd take another. It'd take it up until about 10 o'clock. You'd be cleaning up the trays, and then you'd have to swab the decks in the mess area and clean up, and then stand inspection probably about 11 o'clock, and then start setting up for lunch. And you'd finish up lunch possibly around 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and sometimes you could catch a nap, and then you'd be back into that mess hall at 5 o'clock. You lived right there in the mess hall, by the way, but that was terrible. 3 months of that, but I was saved by a chief of mine who was one of those boxing type fans, and he knew that I was a participant. He called me up, and he had me assigned to the chief's mess, where you lived with the chiefs, but you also worked with the chiefs. So there was probably 15, 20 of these chiefs in that mess of theirs, and they had special foods and so on and so forth. So I lucked out. I think the last month of my mess duty I did that. So I had an opportunity to. I always had a way of making my way, especially with that cook from Denver. He would always fix me up with a steak or two, and I'd take it back to the foundry. We had hot plates, and we had coffee going and all that. And so I was always in a position to fix my steaks and whatever else I had, and so I didn't suffer too much.
Were you ever injured in the service?
No. I broke up my hands, so that was about the extent of my injuries. This was a flagship, Joe. It was a 7th Fleet's flagship, and we had a 2-star admiral aboard that ship. And the Hector would sit in Sasebo, Japan, and all of these ships, cruisers, not cruisers, but destroyers and that type of size ship would come up alongside if they needed repairs. Sometimes we'd have a string of maybe 6 or 7 destroyers alongside of this big ship that I was aboard. Once a month, we'd weigh anchor, and we would head out of Sasebo, and we'd go up to the bomb line, Korean bomb line. I would presume maybe the 38th parallel, maybe beyond, and get over there, and we'd sail back and forth 3 or 4 days a month, and then we'd come back to Sasebo, and for that we got combat pay.
Very nice.
The admiral saw to it that he was getting combat pay. Subsequently, all of the ship's company was getting combat pay.
What awards or citation accommodations did you receive in the service?
None that I was just a regular type guy, I mean, when you talk about GI Joe and this and that, that's if there's the equivalent of a Navy GI Joe, that's what I was. I made it pretty easy on myself.
How were you treated by the community and your family after you arrived back in the States after leaving Korea?
How was I treated?
Yeah.
Joe, when I first got out of high school, I went to work at Samsonite Luggage Manufacturing Company. And when I went into the Navy, I left my job there. So when I came out of the Navy, I went right back to work over there. And they had me assigned to the shipping department. I got married. We did a tour of duty over in Korea and came back. And at the time I was going with my wife, we got married. And I went back overseas. But I came home on an emergency leave, and she got pregnant. And I was supposed to get out in February of 1954. Yeah, 54, February of 1954. But I went to talk to the executive officer because I knew my wife was going to have the baby around December. Well, this must have been in maybe September, and I went in to see the executive officer of the ship, and I told him that I wanted an early out. I told him, I'm going to be getting out of the Navy in February, so I want to know if I can't get out 3 months early because of my wife having a baby shortly, within a month or month and a half. And he listened to my story. This is a lieutenant commander. He listened to my story. He says, I'm going to tell you something, sailor. As long as you're there for the laying of the keel, you don't have to be there for the launching. And I looked at this guy. He says, denied. And I got up feeling so damn bad that I walked back, dejected. And shortly after that, this yeoman, a buddy of mine from Albuquerque, and he must have went in and put a word for me, because he came back about an hour later and he called me. I was down the foundry. He called me. He says, Lou, don't feel so bad. He says, you've been approved. You'll be leaving the ship shortly. So, I got out 3 months early.
Mm-hmm. Was it difficult for you to adjust to life in the U.S. when you came back?
Joan, yeah, it was, because I came home 5 days before our oldest daughter was born. And I got out of the Navy in, I came home Thanksgiving Day of 1953. Yeah, was it 53 or 54? Anyway, maybe it's 54. 5 days later, I was back to work. And it was because of the young baby, and and we had to find an apartment, and we started out from with nothing, my wife and I. Yeah, it was tough.
How do you think the war affected your life?
Well, in a positive way, Joe. I ended up going to school as a result of it, and I enrolled over at University of Colorado's Extension Center, and I started in, I think, January of 1954, and I continued to go into school. I did about 3 years. I got in in 54, and I think I ended up attending my last classes in 1958. But by this time, I was already on the police department, starting to see an opportunity to advance while I was on the police department.
Did you use the GI Bill for your education?
Oh, yeah.
How about for a home?
Yeah, same way. Yeah.
Did you join any organizations after the war? LULAC, American Legion, VFW, any of those veterans organizations?
You know what? I worked at Central Bank. My God, that's another thing. I started working for Central Bank here in the city of Denver as a security officer, and operating I was watching traffic. They had 15 drive-ins in this downtown bank. So I started in there. I spent 27 years with this bank, headed up their security, and I must have had, during my time at this bank, I must have had 50 different police officers working off and on that job. But I was there 27 years.
Do you think the war had any different effect on the Latino community than it did on other communities?
Oh, I think it opened a lot of doors. I think that there was a hell of a movement during the civil unrest that brought about this, and there were organizations here in the city of Denver, such as the Brown Berets, such as the Black Panther Party, such as Corky Gonzalez and his people, the Crusade for Justice, and they brought about change. They brought about change, and in many ways, I didn't agree with their method of bringing about change. During that period of time, Joe, there was bombings taking place here in the city of Denver. As a matter of fact, 3 or 4 bombers from that Latino organizations blew themselves up during that period of time. So that I had objections to that. I didn't have any problem with demonstrations and them voicing their opinions. I felt, they got as much right as anyone else, and that's their constitutional right to speak out. And here I was on the other side of the fence as a police officer, having to perform my duties, and yet these people marching back and forth, and quite often, the people that would be marching would be people that I knew, people that I had relations with, you know. But I always had their respect. I never overstepped my authority as a police officer when it came to performing my duties.
We're going to stop the tape in just a moment here because we'll change tapes and we'll get into police work. But is there anything about the Korean War do you think that hasn't been told or has not been told accurately?
Well, I've read a lot on that Korean War, and I always felt that after reading, I think there was a lot of things that were withheld from the American public, things that took place on the part of the higher up, the hierarchy of the military. Take for instance MacArthur and the way he did it. There was a lot of things that were kept from the American public that I think that they should have been brought aboard. I have to applaud Harry Truman, President Truman, for finally taking the bull by the horn and getting rid of that man. But up until he did that, he was the untouchable.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the tape right now, and then we'll start the other one in a moment.
You want a drink? Pop?
September 7th, 2011. This will be tape 2 of 2 of my interview with Lou Lopez in Denver, Colorado. Lou, so tell me how you ended up getting on the police department after your military service. How that happened?
Joe, I think that there was always a want to become a police officer, even when I was a young high schooler. I started going with my wife while we were still in high school, and my wife will really laugh about this. She says, when she first met me, I told her I wanted to be a cop, and she says, she laughs about that today, want to be a cop when you're a high school kid. But I did. I was wanting to be one.
So what is your wife's name?
Carol.
Carol, and how long have you been married? When did you get married?
Believe it or not, Joe, we were married in November of 1952. I had gotten back from overseas, and I got married on an 18-day leave, and that's the way it started.
So what has Carol done for a living?
Well, you know that she worked for United Airlines, and in reservations, and she worked up until the time that she got pregnant. I came home on an emergency leave, and put one in the oven. ended up coming home 5 days before that child was born, our oldest daughter. So she's been a homemaker right along since then.
Tell me about your family, your children, your grandchildren.
Well, yeah, we have 2 daughters. Barbara, who's a human resource director for the Chicago Tribune. She heads up the human resource division for the Tribune's West Coast television and radio conglomerates. Jane is a retired National Park ranger and currently works for the state of Colorado in the forestry division with offices at CSU.
Very nice.
Yeah.
And
Well, we have a deceased son,
okay.
Paul, who was a police officer probably 4 years.
And do you have grandchildren?
Yeah, we have 2, believe it or not. One is she's a property manager in Richmond, Virginia, and has a 8-year-old son who's our great-grandson. She's a single mom, and we have another granddaughter who's 18 years old, currently enrolled and attending the University of Wyoming.
Excellent.
Yeah.
there anything else you'd like to add about your family or anything?
Pardon me?
Anything else you'd like to add about your family? Or you raised them all here in Denver?
Yeah, they were all raised here in Denver. Our son was kind of a tragedy. He served on the police department for 3 years, Joe, or 4 years, and he was assigned to the northeast quadrant of the city. Received a call, a domestic disturbance type call, and he and his partner arrived there, and this fella had a weapon, and they were at the front door. Paul was at the front door. That's the name of our son. And the guy would not put his gun down. He fired 2 shots at Paul, and Paul returned fire and shot and killed this fella. And that tended to be the spiral of that young son of ours' life, because he never really got over that. He was a very tender-hearted guy. And about 6 months later, he had an automobile accident, lost the palms of both of his hands and his trigger finger. And they had him on limited duty. And he got a divorce during that period of time and was married shortly for a short period of time. Ended up having a domestic problem with his wife, argument, and he ended his own life. So yeah, that's a tragedy that we have lived through, but you get past those things, but you never forget them. But certainly he would have been would have been retired from the police department by now. Never had any children, but it was a tragic set of circumstances that happened to him, and has happened to a lot of other police officers. There was a succession of things that took place in that young guy's life: the taking of a life, the divorce, the automobile accident, the loss of his career, possibly. So that in itself was a tragedy.
What year was that?
1981, Joe.
And how old was he?
25. Well, it did, Joe. But the thing about us is we're very tight knit. I can always rely on my wife. She's my right arm, and of course, our 2 daughters, very, very strong, supportive people. So we got past it, but it's not a forgotten thing.
Right.
Yeah.
You could ever forget a child.
No.
So after you got out of the service, you had a series of smaller jobs at the central bank, different banks.
As a police officer.
Okay, so what year did you come out of the police department?
I came on in 1955, January of 1955.
And what was the testing process like to get out of the police department?
Well, it was pretty tough, because a lot of returning servicemen at the time make an application at the time. And I think that at the time that I took that examination, there must have been about 600 that took it. And I ended up the 12th man in my class. There were 27 men in my academy class.
What was your badge number?
5512, meaning I was the 12th man in my class, and I came on in 1955. So anytime you see 5512, you better pay respect and bow your head, because I'm a dinosaur in the eyes of many younger officers.
So how many Latinos were in your class when you got hired?
There was one other, but in many ways this guy never claimed his being what he was. I remember one time Sam telling me he was an Italian, and I jumped all over him like. Anyway, we maintained a good relationship, but that was the way he was.
How many Latinos were in the police department?
There were 2 others.
Wow, and out of how many officers?
At the time, I think there was about. I'm trying to think. Maybe 500.
Okay, so it's a lot smaller then. So
yeah.
Who were the other 2?
Well, there was a fellow by the name of Chris Herrera and Paul Montoya. Paul Montoya ended up being the division chief and Chris Herrera captain.
So they did all of you did well.
Yeah.
So
Well,
what is your memories of them, Chris Herrera?
Paul, of course, Paul I worked for in crimes against persons. Spent all my time in the detective bureau up in the robbery detail. He was my boss, a sergeant. I had a great deal of respect for him. Chris Montoya was pretty much the administrative type. I remember the manager of safety coming to me and offered me a job in his office. And that just wasn't my bag. To go into an office and be a gopher, more or less, for somebody like that. I mean, he was a great man too, but I turned him down, and I told him, I says, I have somebody in mind that might want to take this job. So I got a hold of Chris Herrera, and my God, he jumped right at it, and he ended up probably spending 3 or 4 years in that job. Yeah.
What things did you notice about being Latino in the police department when you started? Did you notice any differences how you were treated?
Yeah, Joe, at that time there was a lot of, I classify them as rednecks. And I worked in a substation where, my God, they were drinkers, they were carousers, a lot of good cops within that substation, but I was subjected to those guys and had to work alongside them. I can recall one time I was standing roll call, and there was a comment made by somebody behind me about standing next to this other fella that was another patrolman, saying you're standing next to a Mexican, and the comment on this officer was, "It's all right because I have my Mexican repellent on." But that was the type of mentality that existed with some of these lowbrow, Neanderthal type individuals that I had to work with at the time. And you know something, Joe, that I looked at that situation, I thought, yeah, shake your head and just go on about your business and make an example of them as a result of the hard work you're going to put forth. And I did. I made detective in a short period of time as a result of that attitude. I was a patrolman for 5 years and made it. And back in those days, it was unheard of. I took the examinations. Back in those days, you took examinations for detective, and I made it. But I marched past those guys, and I never forgot, some of the treatment that I had received from some of those individuals. And most of them were, lowbrow, like I said, Neanderthal type individuals. Had no business being police officers, but there they were. And many of those guys lost their jobs. A lot of those guys ended up being part of the burglary scandal here in the city of Denver.
That was in the 60s, and what?
Yeah.
50-something police officers went to prison over that?
Yeah, there was, I think there was about 62 of them that went to prison. And you know something, Joe, I knew many of them. And I'll tell you something. They fit right into that category of what I just described, of them being redneck, clannish, cliquish individuals, I'd be out working my butt off, working, off duty. And these guys would be riding around in newer automobiles and taking vacations to Vegas, going off on their days off and spending it on the lakes, in their motorboats. That type of existence, very clannish and very cliquish. Those were the guys that were involved in burglaries right here in the city of Denver, in uniform, going in and out of the markets in the middle of the night, cutting safes open, walking away with the contents of the safe. Officers outside on duty, watching over them, and keeping in touch with the radio. That was the type of stuff that went on in those days. It was a sickening event. I almost left the police department in 1965 as a result of that.
You decided to stay and just make it.
Well, I was we went on a vacation in California, and while in California, I read in the paper where they were giving the examinations in San Jose. So I contacted them, and they said, yeah, come on down. I took the examination, and I told them I was on vacation. So I took the written one day. I took the physical agility the following day. I took the mental and the physical that same day. And then the third day I took the oral examination. I passed them all, and they offered me a job. And at the time, my God, we were poor, really, really bad. I mean, even though I was working extra and so on and so forth, it was still a struggle. And they didn't offer any pay to move me. They wouldn't help me with the move from Denver to California. And I got back, and I weighed it, looked at it from a financial angle, and I had to tell them no, I couldn't take it. But I was already a detective at the time, so I made sergeant shortly after that. So it was something like that. But I was very unhappy with my lot in life as far as a police officer, and I think that was the only time I had a low ebb in my career.
What was the relationship between the police department and the Latino community when you started?
Just like I told you, rednecks, involvement in
the Latino community.
Bad,
What types of things would they do that you saw?
Verbalizing, brutal attacks on helpless people at times, and most of them being minority types. I worked in a quadrant of the city where there was a lot of black citizens and Hispanic citizens, and almost 90% of the officers that were out there were Anglo types. But Joe, I don't want to draw the picture that we had a rampant group of officers out there that were involved in all of these things. We had good, solid officers. Many of them went on and became outstanding officers. But no, there was that element out there.
Do you think it changed over time? The attitude between the relationship between the police department and the Latino community has changed or improved over the years?
It has to some degree, Joe, but I think that the pressure has come from outside to the inside, and it hasn't come as a result of the departments really wanting to embrace that group. There are still pockets of hierarchy within the police department that have that kind of mentality, where they have a superior form of mentality.
Are they in a position of power with
Absolutely,
the police department?
absolutely. Many of them are.
Yeah.
But they're the types that are shrewd. They won't come right out. I mean, they have it's all a type of an underhanded type of a mentality that they possess.
Do you think? Have you felt the need for more Latinos on the force?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. I think that we have to see more Latino advancement in terms of them becoming sergeants and lieutenants and captains and chiefs. I don't see that. For the number of officers on the police department, we have a low, as far as I'm concerned, a low number of officers in command positions within this police department.
During your career with the police department, did you try to mentor or work with the community and try to recruit more Latinos on the job?
You know something, Joe, that during my time, being that there was only 3 of us on the police department, to go out and start beating drums, it would have been tough to do. What I tried to do is do it through example and bring about an image, and that image reflecting back to those Latina police officers that were on the department. Well, I'll tell you something, Joe. That I used to bring in Latino officers into units that I would command, for instance. And I mean, this police department has had outstanding Latino police officers serving it. For instance, yourself. Hundreds of incidences out there that sometimes it's not recognized by the department.
When did you start to see the change in numbers of Hispanics growing in the police department?
Well, like I said, I think that there was a movement. I think after that civil unrest period, that throughout there was a wave throughout the United States to recognize and to give minorities more of an opportunity, and this came about within our own police department.
Would you say that was during the 70s or the 60s, or when do you think that?
I'd say in the 70s. More so in the 70s. There was a bigger push in the 70s.
Maybe Paul Montoya or other Latinos on the job, did any of them mentor you or give you advice? Or
I think Paul was my mentor. You know, I looked up to Paul, and I worked for him. I was a detective working the robbery detail under Paul. So, you know, he was pretty much the guy that I respected, and his respect went beyond me. It went to the other officers, the Anglo officers, the other officers that up in the detective bureau. He was legendary.
And why was he legendary? What types of things made him that way?
Like I said, the image thing. You know, that his drive, the way he would treat people, the way he would command, supervise. I mean, everything about the man was outstanding.
Would he give you any advice about being Latino or how it might affect you?
No, you know, Paul grew up in a he had a tough life, and no, Paul never really came out and said do this or do that, or you know, why don't you become this or why don't you. It was always by example.
What type of life did he have that made it tough?
Well, Paul, as I recall, was a single. He had a single mom, was raised alone. I think he had one brother, two brothers, one brother, possibly a sister, but lived over on the west side. Had a hard life. Ended up in the Marine Corps, became a captain in the Marine Corps, fought the battles in the South Pacific during World War II.
And wasn't Chris Ferrer also a war veteran?
Chris was, I didn't learn this until later. Chris was apparently an officer in the Air Force and a pilot. Whether he was a pilot or a bombardier, navigator, I don't remember. But I read it recently about him. But he never once mentioned his military background. And Paul didn't really talk about it much either.
When do you think the first Latinos came on the police department? Do you know who that might have been?
Well, there was a fellow by the name Fred Renevato, who was shot and killed, by the way. And I think that was in the 20s. Yeah. He was a detective.
And you think he was one of the first?
Yeah, I think so.
And he died as a result of bootleggers, didn't he?
I don't recall.
Okay, I kind of read something on that. Do you think that promotions were fair for everybody, including Latinos, in your experience?
Yeah, I really think there were. Joe, if there was any type of hanky-panky that went on in the civil service, I never knew about it. You know, I would take those examinations and cross my fingers and hope that I made it high enough to end up being promoted.
Can you kind of go through your career? You made detective what year, sergeant, and kind of what you did on the police department?
Yeah, Joe, I think that 1955 until about 1960, I was a patrolman. Worked, like I say, on the east side of the city of Denver, amongst a lot of minority kids in housing developments. And I think the very first thing that I wanted to do was to establish myself with little people. I'd see them running down the alleys with pop bottles at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning through the glass, the broken glass in the alleys, running over to the mom and pop grocery store to get the 5 cents deposit for the bottle, and maybe end up drinking a pop coming back home, or coming back to the housing project where mama may have been shacking up with some guy, or was passed out, or whatever the case may have been. But I established myself with a lot of those little people, knowing that by the time they grew up, they were either going to go this way or go this way. And either way, I would profit, because I got to know them, and I got to establish a relationship with them. And it helped me out in many, many ways during my patrolman years. And then when I got up in the detective bureau, it helped me out. Anyway, I did this for 5 years. I spent most of my time in the areas around the housing developments and that as a young patrolman. So that was where I cut my teeth. I almost got shot probably my third year on the police department. I responded to a incident where a guy was reported to have a gun, and I got to the house, and I was met at the front door by this guy holding a .25 automatic on me. And when I saw that, I grabbed him by the arm with both hands, and we wrestled. It seemed like 5-10 minutes. See, and this guy would always try to get that gun into my body. But we finally fell off of the porch and wrestled the gun out of his hand. But later found out that was a guy, he was a walk away from the state hospital. And his intention was to go home and murder his wife and his kids. I always worked extra. Like I told you, I ran a operation at a bank for 27 years. I recall one day sitting directing traffic there, hearing somebody shouting, and I looked up, and it's a summer day, and there's a guy on a 5th-story ledge of a building, and about ready to jump. And I got on the phone, and I called the police dispatcher, and I said, I'm working extra, and there's a guy on the 5th-story ledge of the CU Extension building about ready to bail out. Send me some help, but please no sirens. So I ran across the street and 5 stories up the stairs, and when I got into this classroom, this was a CU Extension. I'm looking at this guy's bare ass. Anyway, I get his clothing, and I find his name, and I'm leaning out the window talking to him. In the meantime, the fire department gets there, and they have this net out for him. And pretty soon some police officers come in to the room, and there were 3 windows there, and he was in the center window. And I was able to bring the window up inches. He would lean forward, and I'd bring the window up. In the meantime, there was another officer talking to him. And I finally got the window up where it was halfway up. And I told the officers, I said, behind me, I says, grab me by the Sam Brown, my belt. And I says, I'm going to lean out and grab this guy. And if he goes alone. I'm not going to go with him. So sure enough, I got that window up, and once again looking at his bare ass. I lean out the window, and I grab him and give him a bear hug around you know where. Mm-hmm. And I drug him in. He doubled up like an accordion and brought him in. And I don't know whether he was on drugs or what. He had to have been on drugs. But either that or he was a student there at the Extension Center. He must have gotten his midterm grades or something. Anyway, that was one of the incidences I recall. I was involved in a hell of a lot of things when I was a patrolman, from chases to you name it, At the bank, I solved a couple of bank robberies that occurred in the bank. Um, just a whole lot of things that occurred in my career as a patrolman. And you know, one of the driving forces was that image thing that I talked about earlier, and the fact that you know I worked around a bunch of people that I had no respect for, and all I wanted to do was make my way and get away from it, which I did. Taking the examinations, going up in the detective bureau and into the robbery detail. And it seemed like in the robbery detail I blossomed. Case after case after case that I was involved in, solving big robberies, bank robberies. One time my partner and I, a fellow by the name of Don Brannon, spent 8 years as a partner with him. One time they pulled an armed robbery of a bank and a kidnapping in Park County, Fairplay, Colorado. And they went in and tied up the bank president and his wife, and got the president to go in and open up the safe, and they took all of the money and left. Well, Don and I were called in the chief's office the following day, and the sheriff from that county explained to the chief that he didn't have the manpower nor the capability of conducting the investigation. So he wanted some Denver police officers to get involved, so the chief assigned Brannon and me to the investigation. And shortly thereafter, we came up with the car and examining the records of a rental car. We were to determine the operator of the car and another person that signed the receipt. And it so happened this other person was a ex-Denver police officer that I knew. So off of the information of the rental agreement, we had an address, and we hit the place about 1 o'clock in the morning, and with the search warrant. They weren't there, but 2 women were there and 2 kids. And the house looked like a department store. They must have gone out on a spending spree, because there were new shoes and boxes of this and boxes of that, and new dresses and so on and so forth. So we knew we had them, and it took a little while, but they finally admitted that the 2 fellows that we were looking for were the ones that pulled the robbery. And they were, I found 2 airline tickets in one of the drawers. They would leave Denver that day and fly to Los Angeles, where they were to be met at the airport by their boyfriends. So instead of them going, Brannon and I jump on a airplane, and we get there maybe 2 hours before they were supposed to be met by their boyfriends. So 2 hours later, we arrested both of these guys at the Los Angeles airport, and we recovered probably another maybe $150,000 in traveler's checks and another $50,000 in cash. It was a big arrest, and we brought them both back. But there were cases like that, time after time after time during that period of time, came out in the newspapers and so on and so forth. I served in that capacity for 8 years, and then I went over and commanded the sex detail, and I didn't care for it. Carol says, "You don't like sex." And I had kind of chuckled at that, but I then went back into uniform, and while I was in uniform, I was selected to go in and start the first SWAT unit here in the city of Denver, called the Special Services Unit.
What rank were you then?
I was a sergeant at the time, and I served with 3 other sergeants and a lieutenant as our commander. And it was a federal grant, and we had something like 27 men that we handpicked. So we had 27 people out there. I had 9, and each one of the other sergeants had 9. Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated about that time, and all hell broke loose in the city of Denver. And we had been prepared some 6 months training to address the issues at the time. And there was rioting and fire bombings and snipings and all types of things. Looting, a lot of looting, a lot of civil unrest during that time. And that went on for about initially right after the assassination for a good 2 weeks here in the city of Denver. Finally settled down. But every night there was some activity. The Black Panther Party came into being at that time, and of course the Hispanic counterpart of it, the Crusade for Justice, came into being. Corky Gonzalez, whom I knew very, very well, was part of that. And he did a great job in terms of addressing issues and so on and so forth. But there was a certain element within the Brown Berets that started mommings, and that was, I objected to that. As far as them demonstrating, my God, they had that right. And anyway, I served in that capacity probably for another 2 years, and then I got involved with a youth boxing program here in the city of Denver. I was called in the chief's office and told that Denver businessmen wanted to support a inner city youth boxing program. Would I be able to do it? And I said, hell yes, I could do it. I have the contacts and the connections. But I said, I'd like to meet the gentleman. So they told me who the gentleman was, and it was a fellow by the name of Bill Daniels. And I met him in his office on 17th Street. Sitting alongside of him was Vince Barilla, an All-American basketball player at the time, who was a businessman. And they both of them owned the Utah Stars. They're still in existence, out of Salt Lake City. And I talked to Bill, and Bill Daniels says he was interested in starting a boxing program. And he says, I'll furnish all the equipment and so on and so forth, all the costs. And I said, well, there has to be something more to this, Bill. What's your intention with an inner city boxing program? He says, well, I'm interested in starting a boxing league similar to a baseball, a football, a basketball league, professional type thing. And he says, I need a farm system. I need to get young boxers that would be able to participate as team members of a team that I intend to put together. And I said, how much time are you looking at? He said, about 3 years. And I said, Bill, you don't have to look at 3 years. I said, you already have a tailor-made boxing team right now. All you do is take the current Golden Glove champions at all weights, and you have your team. He says, well, what about coaches? I says, you have some of the finest coaches here in the city. And I named Art Orlando, and I named Joe Garcia. Joe Garcia had been my coach when I was a little guy. And sure enough, he put a boxing team together consisting of these people. And they were known as the Rocks. Bill Daniels was a tremendous man, and was able to organize a national movement with amateur boxing teams. Eventually would have been professional, but he talked business people into putting teams together in places like Dallas, Texas, and Los Angeles, and New York City, and so on and so forth. They even went into having international bouts with, for instance, the Russians came in here and boxed. But one of the things that I like to talk about is Ron Lyle, Ron Lyle was a ranking heavyweight during the 70s. And he was serving time in Canyon City as a result of a situation here in the city of Denver. He came out of Canyon City, and his parole officer contacted me, a fellow by the name of Fred Lane. And he said, Lou, I have a heavyweight that I want to get involved in your boxing program. He says he can kick a football 80 yards, and he's a heavyweight champion of the boxing team in Canyon City, the state penitentiary. And he's coming out on parole. And I told Fred, I said, no, Fred, I can't deal with him, but I know who can. And I gave him the name of Bill Daniels. And I guess Fred contacted Bill Daniels, and that was the way Ron Lyle got introduced to Bill Daniels, and Bill Daniels took him into his wing. Eventually, Ron became like I said, a ranking world heavyweight champion. Fought them all, from George Foreman to Ernie Shavers, all of these ranking heavyweights. He lost a championship bout to Muhammad Ali in the 11th round, and up to that point he was leading. So I organized that boxing program out of a city recreation facility, and started a youth boxing program. And they were nationally ranked. Over the years, I took those kids all over the country, took them to the national PAL boxing tournament in Anderson, Indiana, and I mean there were teams from throughout the United States at this boxing meet. And this little scroungy Denver, I shouldn't say scroungy, but this little group of little people out of the city of Denver, coming out of Las Casitas in the Sun Valley housing development, ended up being taken second place in the nation.
Majority Latino?
They had five individual champions come out of that team.
Majority Latino?
All of them except one black kid. Yeah. And I'll tell you something. I mean, those little guys did such a job in Anderson, Indiana, that I had the national AAU president write me a personal letter telling me how impressed he was with the demeanor of these young people, how well trained they were, and such good sportsmanship. You know, before they went out there, we had these kids dressed, I mean, immaculately. We had workout gear for them, and they all had long hair, chongos. We had them put their hair up in chongos, and they went in there. And I mean, those, yeah, Anderson, Indiana. They back in those days, they hadn't seen a lot of Latinos. Maybe in the picture shows, they'd see Latinos in the Treasure of the Sierra Madres or something, or maybe an Indian movie or something. But here they were in living color, and these people did a number. I mean, they were a dynamite team. So anyway, I was very proud of that. And eventually, from the original boxing team, it turned out to baseball and football and basketball. Eventually, the birth of the police athletic league. But the interesting thing about Bill Daniels, I would put on about 2 shows a month in this rec facility over at Rudy Park, called Rudy Park here in the city of Denver. And the mamas of these little kids would be in the kitchen making burritos, and they would sell the burritos during the fight, you know. And Bill Daniels would come to these fights, and he'd bring some of his classiest looking women you ever saw in your life, and they'd sit in there. They stuck out like a diamond, you know where, yeah, in the rough. But there they were in the stands, and I remember going over and getting them each a burrito and and a bottle of pop and setting them up. But I'll tell you something, Joe. I hustled. I used to hustle for those boxing shows. I had a buddy that owned a meat company, and he would donate maybe a couple of boxes of weenies for me. The Pepsi-Cola company, the manager was here in the city of Denver, was a great friend of mine. And he would have a truck come over, and they'd set up a Pepsi-Cola machine, and we had free pop. I'd go over to the Star Bakery over on the west side, and I'd get day-old buns. Anyway, we had it going, and those little people that I worked with during those years, many of them today are parents, and their own little kids are participants in the PL system. But I see a lot of them now, you know, and I have a great deal of fondness for that particular phase of my existence. As far as my career, I went from sergeant up to lieutenant, commanded juvenile operations. One outfit they knew was the Juvenile Delinquency Prevention Unit, and that was another federal grant. It came into being the latter part of the 70s, and through the federal grant, I was able to pick up probably 24 people, 2 sergeants, and get the equipment. And we went into operation towards the latter part of the 70s, working with the juveniles. I was also the supervisor or the commander of the school resource officers unit, where officers were assigned to the schools. And these two units worked very, very close together. And it was during this period of time that these officers, these juvenile delinquency officers working in areas of where juveniles would hang out, started coming back with reports about the development of gang type situation. And came down to it came down to this, that there was a lot of young people being shipped from California, primarily East LA, to the city of Denver, by parents who had relatives here in the city of Denver. And these little kids, little cholos that would come from LA, I mean, showing that macho stuff, the first thing they started doing was putting the graffiti up and talking the talk and dressing the dress. And pretty soon rolling over a lot of our local kids, and eventually the development of youth gangs here in the city of Denver. And it wasn't, it was the Hispanic gangs that really started up here in the city of Denver. And then the black gangs came into being, the black gangs being forced out of South Central in Los Angeles. And a lot of those people came into the city of Denver. And it was like a smorgasbord for them. These high rollers that were involved in distribution of crack and so on and so forth would set up their operations here in Denver. And eventually they would educate, and pretty soon you started seeing black gangs in the city of Denver. And that's the way it started. But it all came as a result of this delinquency prevention unit, which was actually the first gang unit here in the city of Denver. By the time I left the department, we had things pretty well set up in that operation. We had databases on the gangs, the gang members, the girlfriends, the boyfriends of the girls, where they lived, the parents, what type of automobiles they were driving, what areas of the city they were. And I had officers, instead of throwing these officers out for an 8-hour shift, I had them assigned to gangs. I had 2 or 3 officers or 4 officers assigned to a particular gang. So we impacted the situation in the city of Denver.
And what year did you leave the department?
I retired in 1984 when I went to work with the Denver Public Schools.
I need to pause right there 1 second. Okay. All right, Lou, is there anything now that you'd like to add about your experience with the police department? Anything involving the Latinos that you would like?
No, Joe, I talked a lot of negative stuff here, but I don't want to leave this interview with that, being negative about things. I've always looked at things straight in the eye, and I didn't take the negative things into being. I always thought that there was a better way of handling things, and it just. But you have to get involved. You have to be involved. You can't do it sitting on the desk and not doing it. I can recall my boss, a division chief, when I had my offices down at the headquarters, saying, "Well, where are you, Lou? I never see you in your office." And I said, "Well, my job isn't in the office. It's out here. I have 120 Denver public schools I'm responsible for. I have 4 quadrants of the city where juveniles are running around." I says, "I've got responsibilities over there. I have to make contacts with people at every level." So anyway, he used to. I stayed at that position. He must have felt I was doing a job, because he never came back for me and anchored me at my desk.
What advice would you like to give to Latinos listening to this interview?
I don't know. I would hope that not only myself, but a whole lot of other Latino officers, that they can rely on and look upon their careers and try to pattern themselves after some of the things that have taken place. I take a lot of pride in the Latino officers on this police department and what they've been able to accomplish. I think that of any group in the police department, they are the most highly decorated of all officers on the Denver Police Department. And it comes as a result of good, solid police working hard work. Um, yeah, I would say to any young officer, don't be looking over your shoulder. Don't be thinking that you can ride somebody else's coattail in success. You have to do it in your own. But there's plenty of help out there and people that you probably will be admiring, and they're the ones that can help you out.
What would you like future generations of your family who will see this maybe 25, 30 years from now, what would you like them to know?
You know something, Joe? That I put together my life story in book form. I've done that, and much of what I've talked about is in this journal that I put together, and each one of my kids has it, including hand drawn artist work. I talked about tranvías. Ever hear the term tranvía? That's that's a streetcar, a tranvía. Anyway, I drew the old tramway streetcars and where I used to catch them and different things. But this is in a journal, and each one of our kids has a copy of this journal. The other thing that I did, Joe, is I put together my life as a detective, primarily in the robbery detail. And I know that during that period of time, I was in the a detective, worked on a lot of cases, and had a lot of success in the work that I did. And subsequently, there was a lot of news articles that would come out. And my wife, over the years, would cut out these articles and throw them in a foot locker. And here, about 7, 8 years ago, I was in the garage and I'm looking in this foot locker and I'm thinking, holy smokes, look at all these articles. So I brought them out and I spread them out on the floor and I started taking the articles out and I would paste them in this journal and then handwritten, all of my knowledge about the article and what took place. I ended up with 190 pages of stuff that I have, and that also is in the hands of my family. So they got my journal on my life as a young kid, and my military life, and my life with my right hand, my Carol, my kids. They have that, and then they have this other journal regarding my life. I was recently honored by the Colorado State Golden Gloves Charity Association, and it was quite an honor. About 2 weeks ago, almost 100 people were there, and they awarded me a plaque, and they talked about my accomplishments and achievements, not only in the as a official with USA Boxing. I ended up being a Master USA Boxing official. I officiated in hundreds and hundreds of bouts, both amateur and professional. And they honored me for that, as well as my work as a police officer. So that was my latest honor, and that'll be another part of the journals that police journal and my home life journal that they'll have. I had an opportunity to invite our daughter from Los Angeles. She lives out there, and she came to this event. And our other daughter from Estes Park, she has offices at the University of Colorado State University in Fort Collins. She came down along with her husband. So, that meant a whole lot to me. And I think the biggest thing that I was pleased with as a result of this event was that the people that attended this were my peers, my constituents, people that I worked with, people that had done as much or more than me. And yet here they were paying me homage and paying me tribute. So that to me was far more important to me and meaningful to me than all of the other commendations and so on and so forth that I received, which I think that at one time I counted something like 70 commendations that I'd received in my police career.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add, Lou? Or?
No, I'll tell you something, Joe. I've had a great ride. From the police department to graduating from the FBI Academy to being a forerunner in many ways for young Latino officers. I was the first officer from the city of Denver, Latino officer, to attend that very prestigious academy in Quantico, Virginia. So, yeah, there's a lot of things that I did that I'm quite proud of. But I'm most proud about my accomplishments with my family, you know. So, and my friendships with so many people at all walks of life.
Well, good job. Did a great job. Thank you, Lou.
Yeah.
This will end the interview.